Now we're going to move on to the Mendel's experiments, which are the basis for what's known as Mendelian genetics. Gregor Mendel was a monk who lived in, I think it was about the 1800s, and he did a series of experiments with pea plants and took copious notes and came up with a very surprisingly accurate analysis of how genetics and how traits were inherited. And so first of all, we need again to define some terms. When I speak of allele, I will be talking about a given form of any particular gene. For example, if the gene controls for being either tall or short, or red flowers versus white flowers, I might talk about the red allele or the white allele. And that's the gene that controls that particular trait. Now, if a parent has the same allele with both chromosomes, remember all the chromosomes come in pairs, matched pairs. In humans, it's 23 matched pairs. If they have the same genetic form for a particular allele, then they're called homozygous. So if I say something's homozygous red, that means both chromosomes that have genes that control the color of the flowers are the same, and they're both code for red flowers. On the other hand, if they have different alleles for the same gene, that is, if they're both red, both white, that's homozygous. But if one's red and one's white, that's heterozygous. In the example here, I said tall, if they're both tall or they're both short. But if they have one of each, the term is heterozygous. Now, if a trait is called dominant, it means that trait is expressed even if the other trait is present. So, for example, if you're homozygous red or homozygous white, you're going to have red flowers or white flowers. But let's say you have one allele for red and one allele for white, and every time you produce red flowers. Well, what that means is that red is the dominant form of that gene. On the other hand, if you have to have both white genes in order to have white flowers, then that trait is called recessive. So it means both alleles have to be the same in order to express that trait. So this leads to one of Gregor Mendel's first laws, which is the law of dominance. The law of dominance states that a dominant trait will appear in the offspring if an allele, even if an allele of the different trait is also present. The law of dominance says that the dominant trait is present even if they're heterozygous for that allele. So here are some selected traits that Gregor Mendel used in his pea plants. And the top row are the dominant traits. So you can have round or wrinkled seeds. And so if it's round, that's the dominant trait, and it turned out wrinkled was the recessive trait. The seed color is yellow versus green. Again, yellow is the dominant trait. Purple flowers versus white flowers. The purple flowers were dominant. The pod color, green versus yellow. Green was the dominant. And then lastly, the stem length. Tall was dominant. Dwarf was recessive. And what you notice here is these letters, the dominant trait is in capitals, the recessive trait is in small case letters. And normally you use the same letter and capital versus small letter in order to avoid confusion. Now, the term genotype, I'll say the plant had this genotype. The genotype refers to the combination of inherited alleles. So that's what's actually the genes that are on the chromosome, whereas the phenotype is the physical appearance or the physical characteristics of the offspring, how the genes are expressed. And as I said in the last slide, it's common nomenclature to express the dominant allele as a capital letter D and the recessive allele as a small letter, usually the same letter but small case. And this is the way you keep those things straight when you're doing the various problems. So the problem, or the simple way to show inheritance, is something known as a Punnett square. And a Punnett square just looks at the alleles that the female parent would pass on, the alleles that the male parent would pass on, and the possible offspring are in the boxes. So the eggs can usually have one of two chromosomes. This chromosome has the bar. This one does not have the bar that we're looking at, the gene or the allele that we're interested in, and this one does. And so these eggs are heterozygous, meaning they have one allele that's positive and one allele that's not positive. The male also has one allele that's positive and one allele that's not positive. And then you fill in the box. Here you have these two go in here, so both of these are positive. One of these is positive, the one from here and one here. One of these is positive, and then these two both are negative. So these are all the possible offspring for this potential allele, which is represented by this bar. Now, when you do this with the letters, here the father has one of the dominant aspects of the genotype and one of the recessive, so he's heterozygous for this trait, and the mother, on the other hand, is homozygous dominant. So two offspring are also homozygous dominant, and two offspring are heterozygous, meaning they have both alleles. So this is what's known as a Punnett square. And here's another view of the same thing where you see these two are both heterozygous for A, whatever A represents. And you can see you have one homozygous dominant, one homozygous recessive, and two heterozygous. And this is represented in these percentages. So 1 out of 4 is 25%, and 2 out of 4 is 50%. Now, if we look specifically at the offspring that Mendel was looking at, here he crossed a pea plant that was heterozygous dominant round seed, represented with two capital R's, and he crossed that with a parent that was two wrinkly seed. And since it's recessive, in order to be wrinkly seed, both of these have to be a small r. So it has to be homozygous for the recessive trait in order to express the recessive. Then when you fill this in, what you end up with is 4 offspring, all of which have one dominant allele and one recessive allele. And that's what's known as a hybrid. So the first generation of the cross between a homozygous round seed and a homozygous wrinkle seed is 4 round-seeded plants. All 4 of these will show round seeds, but they will all be hybrids, meaning they will also have the gene for recessive wrinkly seeds. So this hybrid is an offspring with heterozygous genotype that expresses the dominant phenotype of round seeds. Similarly, if you look at the color, if you cross a homozygous pure yellow dominant parent with a pure homozygous recessive green-seeded parent, you get the same result. You get 4 hybrid offspring, all of which will express the phenotype of a white parent or a yellow parent, but they will be hybrid in terms of their genotype. And again, you get 100% hybrid yellow seeds. So what happens if you cross two hybrids, let's say you start with two of the hybrids from the previous crossing, you have one dominant allele and one recessive allele for both parents. And then if you do the cross, what happens is that it establishes what's known as the law of segregation, which means that these will segregate, and it causes the traits to separate from each other. So what you end up, even though you'll start out with two parents, both of which have yellow seeds, you're going to end up with one offspring that has the green seeds. So you have a dominant yellow, a hybrid yellow, another hybrid yellow, and then you have one green recessive. And this is what is meant by the law of segregation, is that even though both parents are yellow, the hybrid allele will segregate or separate itself out in one of the offspring, and you'll end up with one offspring that's totally different from the other three. And so the second generation, remember the first generation was 100% hybrids. The second generation will be 25% homozygous yellow, 50% heterozygous yellow or hybrid yellow, and then 25% homozygous green or recessive green. You have here a pure red parent, and incomplete dominance occurs when neither of these traits are dominant over the other. And so what happens when you mix incomplete dominant situation is you end up, the phenotype of a blended situation is a blend of the two colors. In this case, red and white produce pink. And so the representation here of WW as being large WW is done that way in order to show incomplete dominance. And so you end up with 4 pink heterozygous plants. And this generation is hybrid pink. Now here you have a situation where you have two pure, what we're representing here is 2 traits instead of just one trait. So in addition to round versus wrinkly, we have yellow versus green. And so we have a parent that is homozygous for yellow and also homozygous for round. And so this is a pure homozygous for both of these traits. Similarly, we have homozygous for both the green and homozygous for the wrinkly. And so both the green color, which is recessive, and the wrinkly seed, which is recessive, is expressed in these parents. So when you mix these, you end up with what's known as a dihybrid, which is an organism that is heterozygous for 2 traits, which means it has both alleles, both the yellow and green allele, as well as the round versus the wrinkly allele in the offspring. But all the offspring, despite being dihybrids, all of the offspring will look like the pure yellow round parent, even though they have the genes of the other parent embedded in their DNA. Now, so the first generation is 100% dihybrid yellow and round. But if you mate 2 dihybrids, you'll see that there are 4 possible allelic combinations for each of their germ cells. They can be both dominant traits in one germ cell, one dominant and one recessive round, one dominant, one recessive yellow, and 2 recessives. And similarly with the second parent, when you mix these, you find, I'll talk about the law of independent assortment in a second, but when you mix these, you find a whole assortment of different combinations. And what ends up happening is you end up with 9 phenotypically yellow round offspring, which are all the offspring that are either homozygous for yellow or heterozygous for yellow, homozygous for round or heterozygous for round, because both those are dominant. you end up with 3 yellow wrinkled, which means they're homozygous for wrinkled, but they're either homozygous or heterozygous for yellow. You end up with 3 green round, and then 1 out of the 16 that has both recessive traits, both the green recessive trait as well as the wrinkled recessive trait. Now what this demonstrates is what I've got up here, which is the law of independent assortment, which when you assort, or when you have more than one allele being passed, those alleles are passed totally independent of each other. In other words, the inheritance of one set of alleles, round versus wrinkled, has no effect on the inheritance of the other set, which is yellow versus green. Now there are some, of course, exceptions to what I just said. One of those exceptions is if 2 genes are very close to each other on the same chromosome, sometimes they may be inherited in a linked fashion. And this linkage occurs in reality. It doesn't occur in these typical situations that I'm showing on the slides. So they're not entirely independent. For the purposes of our quizzes and tests, you should assume that everything is entirely independent and that the law of independent assortment is in play, but understand that there is a phenomenon known as linkage. A linkage group is any genes that are close enough together that they could be linked, and they have to be on the same chromosome for that to happen. And sometimes something called recombination occurs, which is when there's an assortment of whole chromosomes during meiosis.